good evening and welcome to a conversation about the rules of political and parliamentary engagement. For a little over 2 years, Oliver Cromwell was right here, buried in this chapel. A stone marks the spot. Buried, that is, until his body was exhumed, his decapitated and decomposing head was stuck on a pole outside Westminster Hall, and the rest of his remains were thrown into a pit somewhere near what is now Marble Arch. And that, I suppose, was the punishment for unparliamentary behaviour. 8 years earlier, in 1653, Cromwell had dissolved Parliament, telling the assembled members, "Ye are a pack of mercenary wretches, and would, like Esau, sell your country for a mess of pottage." He pointed at individual MPs, calling them whoremasters, drunkards, corrupt and unjust men. "Perhaps you think this is not parliamentary language," Cromwell added. "I confess it's not, neither are you to expect any from me." Now, interestingly, at the time, MPs protested less at the unconstitutional action in closing Parliament and more at his unparliamentary vocabulary. The verbal rules of engagement in the palace over the road outlaw certain words. Gutter snipe, stool pigeon, wart and git are among the unparliamentary terms banned by the Common Speaker. When Disraeli was told off by the Speaker for declaring that half the Cabinet were asses, he immediately withdrew, saying half the Cabinet are not asses. Now, two words are considered the ultimate in unparliamentary language: liar and hypocrite. Now, why those words, one might ask, since to most voters, it seems, those are actually the primary attributes of our elected representatives. The answer is to protect the reputation of Parliament and its members, a plan which, I think it's fair to say, has not been quite as effective as hoped. The rules of political engagement have come under particular scrutiny during and after the Brexit referendum campaign. Politicians on both sides of the argument have been accused of what Churchill called terminological inexactitudes, lying, but also of indulging in name-calling and bad-mouthing, insulting opponents rather than listening and engaging with the argument. The echo chambers of social media have magnified the impact of what is seen as a coarsening of national politics, and some question whether our democracy itself has been damaged and requires emergency surgery. My conversation this evening is with a politician who has been on the receiving end of the labels liar and hypocrite rather more than most. Educated next door at Westminster School, he became an MP in 2005 and leader of the Liberal Democrats 2 years later. His 2010 manifesto promised to scrap student tuition fees was abandoned in coalition when he was Deputy Prime Minister, a decision which led comedian Bill Bailey to sing, to the tune of Roxanne, "Nick Clegg, you don't have to wear that dress tonight, walk the streets for money, you don't have to sell your body to the right." Now, there was an apology for a promise we weren't absolutely sure we could deliver, but it was not enough for him to keep his seat of Sheffield Hallam, which went Labour at the 2017 election. He remains, though, very politically active, particularly in his opposition to Brexit and his demands for constitutional reform. So is reform required in the way our politics is conducted as well as constructed? Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable Nick Clegg.
Thank you, Mark, for that charming introduction. And it's an absolute delight to be here, and thank you so much for coming. I want to thank everyone involved in the organisation of this evening to hold this discussion on such an important matter in such a spectacular setting. And as Mark said, I was very lucky enough to be one of the thousands of school children who were marched in and out of Westminster Abbey, having been at school in the school next door. And also in the presence of the current headmaster. I'm afraid it's giving me a sort of rather overwhelming, if imprecise, wish to do something very mischievous. But I will try and resist and instead speak as enlighteningly as I can muster about this very important issue of the coarsening of political language. And as Mark said, and it just reminded us by reading out some of the excellent insults bandied about by Cromwell and others, vitriol, vituperation, shrill language, unparliamentary language is not new at all. It's been around with us really since the dawn of political debate. I was, just by way of preparation for this evening, reminding myself of some of the even more ancient quotes from ancient Rome. Petronius said to one of his opponents, "All you do is run back and forth with a stupid expression, jittery as a rat in a roasting pot." Plautus said, "Everything you say is unbearably boring by Hercules, that it's murder by monotony." So the idea of creative insults is nothing new. Disraeli on the difference between misfortune and calamity is one of my favourites, not least because he said it about one of my heroes, Gladstone. If Gladstone fell into the Thames, that would be misfortune, and if anyone pulled him out, that, I suppose, would be a calamity. Churchill on Attlee, a modest man with much to be modest about. David Lloyd George on Sir John Simon. The right honourable and learned gentleman has twice crossed the floor of this house, each time leaving behind a trail of slime. So vitriol, insults, personal abuse is not new either, nor, as Mark so charmingly reminded me and all of you, is the spectacle of politicians indulging in the poetry and aspiration of opposition, only to be confronted by the invidious compromises and realities and prose of government. I was, alas, not the first, and nor do I suspect I will be the last politician who was unable or incapable or unwilling to do what he or she said in opposition. So the allegation that politicians claim more than they are able to actually do in reality is not new, and I suspect will be with us for a long time as well. Nor is it the case, whilst I hear a lot said about the development of social or information bubbles, particularly with the advent of social media, nor is the creation of our own bubbles something new either. If you think about it, the social identities that we all construct, the accents that we have, or the accents that we affect, the clothes we wear, the wine we drink, the schools we choose to send our children, the cars we buy, the properties we invest in, the holidays we go on, the friends we keep, all of these things, the newspapers we read, all of these things are things which make up the bubbles in which we operate. And Britain, being, alas, still a remarkably and stubbornly class-ossified society in many respects, is one in which all of those subtle or not so subtle accoutrements of the social bubbles in which we inhabit is something which has been with us for a very, very long time as well. So insults, unparliamentary language, the coarse use of vitriol in public and political life, the volatility of elevated expectations and crashing disappointments in politicians themselves, and the bubbles that we all create for ourselves, individually and collectively. None of these things are new. And yet, something seems to be afoot that is qualitatively new. And I just want to spend the few minutes available to me before Mark and I discuss this in greater detail to try and tease out what is qualitatively new. And the first thing I would say is that whilst I sometimes feel that the impact of social media and technology is a little exaggerated, it clearly has brought something materially and qualitatively new to the way in which we can envelop ourselves in our own media and information bubbles in a way that was not the case in the past. Now, a lot has been said, and you'll be familiar with it, a lot has been said about the way in which Twitter, and particularly our Facebook news feeds, have allowed us to inhabit a world in which we only really encounter both people and views and opinions with which we broadly agree anyway. But it goes beyond Twitter and Facebook. It goes beyond our news feeds or our use of Twitter. And I was reminded of this on Saturday. I was having my hair cut, as you might observe. Thank you for asking. And the very nice lady was cutting my hair. She had great, spectacular tattoos of an octopus on each arm. And I said to her, "Oh, why have you got an octopus tattooed on your arm?" She said, "Oh, I love the animals. I think they're such beautiful animals. I love sea creatures." And I said, "Oh, well, then you must enjoy, and I'm sure you'll watch tomorrow night, along with much of the rest of the nation, David Attenborough's Blue Planet 2. And like all good British middle-class families, Miriam and I sit down, our 3 children, watch Blue Planet 2 every Sunday evening. And she said, "Oh, no, I can't watch it." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Well, I haven't paid the license fee. I haven't got the license fee." I said, "Oh, right, why not?" She said, "Well, I don't see any point." I said, "Oh, so what do you watch?" And she said, "Oh, I just love binging on Netflix box sets and series, and that's all I need. I don't need anything else." I thought to myself, firstly, gosh, I hope Tony Hall doesn't listen to conversations like this, because it would send a chill down his spine and all those who want to see the BBC survive into perpetuity. But secondly, it prompted me afterwards to do a little research into the viewing figures of folk like the young lady who was cutting my hair. And it was very, very striking. 82% of viewers aged 16 to 24 watch more than one episode of their favourite television series in a row each month. And more than 1 in 10 in this age group say they binge watch every day. Over 64s watched an average of 5 hours, 44 minutes of terrestrial, old-fashioned broadcast TV per day in 2016, up, interestingly enough, by 50 minutes compared to 2006. In contrast, 16 to 24-year-olds watched 1 hour, 54 minutes a day, down 41 minutes since 2006. And there's a lot for folk like that to watch. For example, there are 7 seasons, that's 115 hours of The West Wing, 8 seasons, 138 hours of 24, 237 episodes of The Big Bang Theory, and 208 episodes of How I Met Your Mother. And as I am furiously catching up with Breaking Bad, a series which was at its heyday when I was in government, when I couldn't watch any television whatsoever, as I watch usually double helpings of Breaking Bad to catch up with my peers who've been telling me for so long how important it is, it occurs to me that my tastes, the tastes of the lady cutting my hair, your tastes, and the tastes of many millions of our fellow citizens, particularly youngsters, are changing radically. So it is not just the opinions we exchange with each other on Twitter. It's not just the news feeds that provide us with a news environment which is remarkably homogenous. It is also the television we watch and indeed the music we listen to. I'm sure I'm not alone in this wonderful setting in observing that the music I listen to, and I love listening to music, I listen to music every day, is provided to me by Spotify. And Spotify and other music services then provide me with endless prompts on the other music I might want to like based on an algorithmic diagnosis of the music I have already listened to. So it is the music, it is the television, it is the taste that we inhabit that technology has allowed us to do so in a way which does create, I think, a deeper, richer, more all-enveloping envelope of taste and opinion than has perhaps been the case in the past. So if vitriol and bubble life is not new, technology certainly has amplified it quite dramatically. Secondly, in the realm of politics, it is equally true, in my view, that the old-fashioned print media, certainly in this country, just as its readership has declined, its apparent partisanship and vitriol, certainly on atom-splitting issues such as Brexit, has increased to near semi-permanent levels of hysteria. Now, there are many reasons for that. Partly, it has to be observed that large parts of our print media, this is not entirely new, but it appears to have, I think, become acute in recent years, are now controlled or edited or in the hands of a remarkably small clique of what happen to be older men with particularly acute prejudices on some of the issues of the day, which they express through their ownership or their editorship of the newspapers under their control. If one just considers the direct and indirect influence of the Barclay brothers, of Rupert Murdoch, the owner of The Sun, and Paul Dacre, the immensely powerful editor of the Daily Mail, it is quite remarkable how the newspaper industry, or rather the frame of reference and frame of debate set by significant parts of the newspaper industry and some of the best-selling parts of it, are now directly controlled by or influenced by a remarkably small and ideologically homogenous cabal of older, to my mind at least, very, very angry men, many of whom don't either live here or pay taxes in this country. And that seems to me to be both dangerous for the quality of our democracy, but also lead to, as I say, a sort of semi-hysterical tone in the political debate of this country, at times of heightened sensitivity, at times of a heightened debate, which was on ample display at the time of the European referendum. Take, for instance, the Daily Mail, which does, for better or for worse, possess an abnormally strong influence in the management of the Conservative Party, not least because so many Conservative Party members themselves read the newspaper. It is really quite striking. In the first years of his editorship, Paul Dacre took the circulation of the Daily Mail to an unprecedented 2.5 million readers. Yet in May of last year, just before the referendum, it had plummeted to 1.5 million, and the owner, Lord Rothermere, was forced to offer a profits warning to the city for the first time recently. So the readership of the Daily Mail, and indeed its commercial health, in many ways are declining and are more fragile than for a very long time. And yet on this all-important issue of the referendum, the Daily Mail whipped itself up, and I suppose some of its readers, into an almost unprecedented frenzy, particularly around the issue of immigration. It is said that Paul Dacre, when in discussion with David Cameron in David Cameron's flat, some time before the European referendum, when David Cameron, I assume, was making what it turned out to be a futile attempt to persuade Mr. Dacre to take a more rounded view of what was at stake in the referendum, it is said that Mr. Dacre pointed to a television which was on in the corner of the room where the evening news was on at that time. And as you will remember, at that time, the daily evening news was dominated by the Mediterranean migration crisis. And it is reported that Mr. Dacre pointed to the pictures of those desperate, desperate people perishing in the Mediterranean, fleeing violence and conflict in Syria, fleeing into Southeast Europe. And he said, Prime Minister, that is the reason you're going to lose the referendum. Because he realized, cynically, but with great prescience, that if he and others were able to confuse in the public imagination the Mediterranean migration crisis on the one hand, and indeed its mismanagement by EU member states at the time, we will all remember the chaotic scenes of barbed wires being erected at borders in Southeast Europe, refugee camps in abysmal conditions being established in a rush, and indeed the terrorist incidents in Brussels and Paris at the time. Mr. Dacre, I think, realized more clearly, certainly than anyone else involved in the campaign, that if these things, terrorism, Mediterranean migration crises, and our membership of the European Union could somehow be conflated in the public imagination, quite understandably and entirely logically, many people would recoil from that prospect altogether. And he was entirely true to his word. On the 23 weekdays before the referendum, the Mail led with the immigration narrative on 17 occasions, usually accompanied with very lurid photographs and headlines such as EU killers and rapists we failed to deport, Cameron's migration deception, and even stories about a one-legged Albanian double killer. And that hyperbole was only, of course, outdone after the referendum when the Daily Mail felt that its victory in the referendum was somehow going to escape its grasp. And we will all recall some of the truly splenetic headlines, such as "Enemies of the People" and "Crush the Saboteurs," expressed in response to those who did not drink the Brexit Kool-Aid in the way that clearly was felt necessary. And I only point that out not only because I strongly, obviously, disagree with the point of view taken by that newspaper and many others, but I describe it to you in that detail because I was an MP for 12 years, I was an MEP for 5 years, so I've been in politics on and off for 20 years or more. I cannot remember occasion where household, so-called mainstream newspapers have toppled from being newspapers into being such hyperbolic, such vitriolic, such semi-hysterical organs of a particular propagandizing, campaigning bent. And that seems to me to be, again, qualitatively new, just as the commercial and readership fortunes of those newspapers decline. So that's the second point. Technology, one. What appears to be happening in some of our dominant newspapers is two. And the third and final point I would make is that there is a volatility in the way in which people now choose the parties they wish to vote for, which has been growing for a long, long period of time. The days where people voted just like their mothers and fathers did, just like their grandfathers and their grandmothers did, just like people did on the street, just like people did in their community, those days are long, long gone. And in many ways, that is a very good thing. The end of diffidence, the end of sort of hand-me-down generational attitude towards voting, all of that is a very, very good thing. We are all, as citizens, empowered, and indeed as consumers, empowered in a way that is unparalleled in human history. At the push of a button, we can marshal information available just to us, tailored just for our needs in a way that is simply without precedent in human history. As consumers, we have available to us a dizzying array of choice, from the holidays we take, from the food that we choose, from the cars that we buy. And that more autonomous, empowered, individualistic, consumerist attitude towards life has definitely been replicated in politics too. So people are now much, much more ready than they were in the past to say, well, I'll try a splash of red one election, didn't like that much, I'll try a splash of blue, I might even try a dash of yellow in between. And there is a sort of jumpy volatility to politics, which you see across the developed world. And as I say, that is broadly a very good thing indeed, because it, beyond and above everything else, it makes sure that those who are elected, there to serve the public, are less and less able to and less inclined to take voters for granted, because voters can take away what they have given much more rapidly than has been the case in the past. But it does lend itself to a sort of mood swing quality in politics, which again I think is qualitatively new compared to the past. I experienced it very fleetingly. In 2010, I was elevated to this great gravity-defying pedestal as if I was capable of all sorts of remarkable feats of political wizardry, before obviously crashing down to earth somewhat with a bump later. Jeremy Corbyn, I safely predict, who is now held aloft in this curious personality cult which sustains some of his core supporters, the expectations of what he is able to deliver if he were ever to become Prime Minister are running so far in excess of what he will be able to do as a Prime Minister when confronted with the realities of government. And so the choosiness and volatility and individualism of voter behaviour, I think will only exacerbate this roller coaster of elevated expectations followed by the sense of disappointment or frustration in the political class. And that seems to me, again, not to be new, but certainly to have become more acute and visible in recent years than in the past. And if I can end on this, we shouldn't panic. Democracy is not coming to an end. Some of these things will pass. new newspaper editors and proprietors will come along. People, I anticipate, will rediscover a hunger to actually be exposed to information and news and opinions which aren't just part of their own bubble and their own circle. We are going through a period of economic and social volatility, not least in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, which hopefully will start to settle down as some of the economic and social damage done to the fabric of our society heals over time. All of these things will pass. But if there's one thing that continues to worry me, it is this. A mature democracy, the elixir, the lifeblood of a democracy, it is many things. It is elections, it's debate, it's parliaments. But above and beyond everything else, it is the ability to bridge and accommodate differences in a plural society where there are competing claims on public resources, there are competing ideologies, there are competing interests, but where we all agree that we engage in democracy in a spirit of give and take. Sometimes this lot wins, the next time the other lot loses and wins, and so on. And we accommodate our differences. That's the genius of democracy, that it isn't a winner-takes-all system. It's one in which competing interests constantly jostle, and where no single interest, no single section of society, no single collection of opinions are utterly disenfranchised, but where everybody feels they have their place in that raucous debate that makes up our democracy. And my worry about the bubble effect of technology, my worry about the kind of mood swing behavior of us as voters, my worry about the almost hysterical vituperation that now colours some of the big national debates which will govern our future, is that none of it is based on the idea of give and take. None of it is based on the idea that those you disagree with have just as much of a right to their opinions or their dreams or aspirations as you do. And that the losing side in an election or the losing side in a referendum in a mature democracy continues to have a right and a role in how those democratic debates continue. It's one of the reasons, I barely mentioned Brexit, but I'm going to conclude on a familiar topic, for me at least. It's one of the reasons why I believe it was such a fatal error in the wake of this very, very finely and narrowly determined referendum, why it was such a fatal mistake for the victors to not acknowledge the dreams and the aspirations and the hopes of the losing side, close to half the voting public, but to declare that from there on in, those who are on the losing side, over 16 million voters and over 70% of young voters, no longer had any right and any legitimate voice in shaping what Brexit would look like. I think that is fundamentally incompatible with how a mature democracy should operate. You cannot delegitimize millions of your fellow citizens in a democracy as summarily as that. And all the features that I have talked to you about, whether it's the old traditions of Cromwell, Disraeli, Gladstone, and ancient Romans insulting each other, whether it is the advent of new technology or the swivel-eyed hysteria of the editor of the Daily Mail, all of these things combine to create something which at the end of the day is very dangerous to the fabric of our democracy, which is an intolerance of those who are in a minority, an intolerance of those who have lost, and an intolerance of those who hold views that are not fashionable. That is something we must resist at all costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Very provocative, full of ideas which we should unpick, I think, to a degree. Let's start with your belief about the newspapers. So this cabal of non-doms who are whose volatility and unprecedented frenzies have so affected people. You could make that point with Brexit, but you really couldn't make it with the 2017 election, where despite the best efforts of Mr. Dacre and many of the Conservative supporting newspapers, of course, we saw the Conservatives lose their majority. I mean, did that not demonstrate, actually, that the newspapers are not nearly as powerful as they like to think they are?
So I wasn't making a point about their power. I was making a point about the way in which they seek to conduct their business on issues which they feel very ideologically strong about. I think it's only about 3% of the British population actually read the Daily Mail. So of course it's never as straightforward as that. People don't just sort of read a newspaper and say, oh, well, I'll follow the instruction of whatever the editor says and how to vote or how to think. Of course not. People have a much more sophisticated and subtle relationship with the newspapers they read, with the information they consume. But my point for the purposes of this evening, which is about the coarsening of language and the use of language in politics, I think we did break through new sound barriers of hysteria and vitriol in those pro-Brexit right-wing tabloid newspapers at the time of the referendum. I cannot remember any time where I've seen such sustained levels of misinformation, propaganda, and vitriol sustained over such a long period of time, and also an extraordinary attack on some of the pillars of our democratic system, whether it's judges, hysterically attacked simply for doing their job of passing an independent judgment, whether it's the independent governor of the Bank of England, again, hysterically attacked. So that's what worries me. I'm not claiming that they're omnipotent. I'm claiming that they are conducting their business in a way which is, I think, certainly through the prism of Brexit, qualitatively new in its hysteria.
I suppose there will be some who would say, this is the rough and tumble of contemporary politics, and you can find examples of newspapers going right back with very powerful front pages, which would look hysterical to some. Actually, those people who can't take it, they're just snowflakes. They should just, grow a pair.
Oh, look, I'm not saying in a free country they shouldn't be allowed to do it. It's a free country, they can do what they like. And I developed the hide of a rhino in response to the sort of ludicrous attacks from folk like that in time in government. But again, I'm not making a judgment about whether people should or shouldn't like it or should or shouldn't resist it. I'm just saying I think it is certainly in recent times qualitatively new at its sort of fevered pitch. Now that was especially obvious at the time of the referendum campaign. And perhaps it was especially obvious because there was such a strong concatenation of some of these vested interests, all in pursuit of a particular outcome. But yeah, look, listen, rough and tumble is a very good thing in politics, and I certainly wouldn't recommend anyone either taking an interest or still less participating in politics if you can't put up with a few unpleasant things said about one, of course. But that's not the point of my remarks. The point is, what does it do for the quality of democratic debate when you have legitimate functions discharged by judges, legitimate functions discharged by the governor of the Bank of England, and they're having to have their identities and their photos and their addresses and their backgrounds displayed, in a deeply intimidating way on the front page of newspapers. That seems to me to be breaking new ground and going and extrapolating well beyond the normal rough and tumble of public and political debate.
I'd like to talk to you about the bubbles, the echo chambers of social media in particular. I was very taken by a slide that someone from Ipsos Mori showed me the other day of the Republicans and the Democrats in America, and they'd asked a large number of people where they stood on a whole range of what might be called liberal and conservative issues, and it was an extraordinary, there was virtually no crossover. There was a sort of blue one there and a red one there and a couple of dots in the middle, but otherwise they were entirely separate. And I wonder to what extent that process where you choose your Twitter feed and your Facebook friends and you surround yourself with people who will confirm your own prejudices, that is really what's going on here, and that is changing the way that our politics operates.
I think it is true for various complex reasons that you see it particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States for some reason. It's one of the most curious developments in modern democratic life that it's the two established Anglo-Saxon democracies that seem to be struggling most with the kind of ructions within their democracy compared to, I mean...
Is it because they're adversarial? You've basically got two sides.
My own view, my own pet, call it Clegg's pet, an entirely unsubstantiated theory, is the following. I think it has something to do with the way in which our economy functions in the United States and the United Kingdom compared to other developed economies on the other side of the channel. Let me explain. Something that is very, very acute in both Britain and America since the 2008 crash in particular has been this remorseless and unstoppable squeeze on disposable income, take-home pay. What does that mean? What does that jargon mean? It means that millions and millions of our fellow citizens on low and middle incomes are working longer hours for the same pay, or working the same hours and receiving less money for their kids, for their elderly parents, for their holidays, for their dreams and aspirations. And that's gone on for 8-9 long years, almost without interruption whatsoever. Now again, simplifying dramatically, in many other European countries, the way they responded to 2008 is that they incurred, tragically, a very sharp increase in unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, which we avoided in the United Kingdom and the United States. But those who were in employment tended to have much higher protections for their in-work entitlements. And I think the political effect of that is that in the United States and the United Kingdom, there are millions of people, and I met many of them, by the way, in the run-up to the referendum when I was campaigning in Sheffield, who just said to me, listen, Nick, I'm not going to vote for a box which says Remain. Why should I vote for something that everything should remain the same? I haven't had a pay rise in 8-9 long years. And it's the bankers' fault, it's you wretched politicians, and it's the regulators. I want to shake things up. I think in other European countries, those who were in work had a much, much stronger incentive to defend the status quo, because the status quo was, in a sense, protecting them more visibly than was the case, or at least felt to be the case, for many millions of voters in the United Kingdom and the United States. So I think it's actually linked back to the way in which we organise our labour market, the way in which we organise our tax system, our welfare system, and the higher tends to be higher levels of in-work poverty and insecurity in the Anglo-American economies. And I think that leads to an entirely understandable, in my view, almost sort of political nihilism amongst people, whether it's in the American Rust Belt or in forgotten parts of the United Kingdom, where they'll just do anything just to be listened to, where they need to shout at the top of their voices to be heard, where I think that's not quite the case in the same way in other European democracies.
Is it not also because, and as a liberal, of course, you're a believer in proportional representation, in having multi-party governments and coalitions, you know, you love all that stuff, but it's not very British, is it? I mean, you know, we like our sort of bipolar way of doing things and the adversarial politics.
Well, I'm not sure it's just that. I mean, there is a school of thought, and I go back now to my undergraduate days as a social anthropology student. There is a sort of school of thought in social anthropology, pioneered by the structural anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss and others, that actually the way all of us as human beings organise our environment is between opposites, male, female, up, down, right, left, good, evil, clean, dirty, and so on, and that the human brain tends to like to organise our life according to these opposites. And anything which messes up a neatly bifurcated mental map tends to frustrate people. And there's quite a lot of evidence that, you know, in that sense, we all like it simple. It's either this or that. Our language, it's on the one hand and the other hand. We don't say and on the third hand. Self-evidently.
Unless you're an octopus.
Unless you're an octopus. But what I mean is, I think we tend to just organise our own lives, and indeed our political maps in that way. But you're right, of course there are institutional reasons as well. In the United Kingdom, architecturally, our politics across the road in Westminster is built for opposition, rather than the horseshoe shaped of other democracies. And of course we have this, what I would regard as truly ludicrous electoral system, which in effect disenfranchises millions and millions of voters.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the public attitude to politicians, because I think that is definitely, you mentioned the nihilism, and I think there is the levels of trust in our elected representatives are at record lows, and some argue that the Brexit campaigns lowered that still further. But isn't there, in your own story in a sense, is the problem, is that the fundamental difficulty is that when you are in opposition you can say one thing, but when you have the system of cabinet responsibility, almost you build in lies and hypocrisy. That is got to be part of it, and the public are searching for authenticity, and what they're getting is people who speak out of the side of their mouths.
Well, look, if that's a sort of indirect allusion to the way I obviously sort of blotted my copybook with...
No, genuinely wasn't that, but I just wonder whether the process where we're at, given that we're discussing the coarsening of politics, actually we need to be thinking about the ways in which we can rebuild trust in our elected representatives, but the way that it operates, particularly in a global media age and social media on top, that business of those with power suddenly faced with the concessions of real politics are constantly seen to be dissembling.
Yeah, well, yes, of course, and politicians should not dissemble, but just can I do something very, very unfashionable, which is just speak up for a minute for politicians. The truth is, and maybe of course politicians should be more candid about this, though I will point out in a minute the flaw of this strategy, is politicians, of course, including prime ministers and any cabinets of all description, are on the whole much, much less powerful than they're held to be. Life is more complicated. The globalized economy means that some of the big things that are brought to bear on governments are entirely beyond the control of national politicians. And yet we, like sort of mice running in a wheel, we have to continually perpetuate this ludicrous assertion that somehow everything is in the gift of politicians. Everything can be fixed. And if there's a problem in hospital X, or a child has hurt their head in community Y, or there's been an outbreak of chickenpox in village Z, it's the politicians. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Is one of the great refrains that we all immediately raise when we don't like something. What are you going to do about it? So we all, on both sides of this exchange between the elected and the elector, perpetuate a myth of supremely sort of powerful, omniscient politicians. Now, you would say, oh, well, why can't the politicians be more candid then? But just imagine if politicians knocked on your door at election time and said, well, I'm not actually very powerful and I can't fix everything and I'll try terribly hard. Well, you're just going to be totally uninterested. You're going to glaze over. You want to hear a bit of, good old-fashioned muscular assertion. They're going to fix this and fix that. It's just the most human thing, and that's what you do at campaign time. So I'd love to think that at campaigns we could paint in pastel colours and introduce all the nuances and all the subtleties. But of course we can't, and we're all in a sense complicit in that. We're all complicit in that. It's a little bit too simple, I find, to say it's all the politicians' fault, as if the politicians are a unique breed of individuals.
I'm wondering whether it's the system rather than the politicians. If you look at the ones, it seems to me the public are desperate for authenticity. They're desperate for people that they think are true to their beliefs. Ruth Davidson, Nigel Farage, Jeremy Corbyn, they're attractive.
But you've read out all people who haven't yet been in government.
Exactly.
And this, with respect, is the key thing. We have to learn that we have to get away from this idea that every compromise with reality is a betrayal. We have to accept that events impinge all the time. 90% of what politicians do in government is react to stuff over which they have a limited or no control whatsoever. And maybe the politicians should be a little bit more forthright about this. But maybe we, since I now can speak as an ex-politician, also need to be a little bit more permissive of the kind of crooked reality of government, particularly at a time, economically speaking, when so much of what influences our life, but not just economically. Look at climate change, look at cross-border crime, look at terrorism, look at cybersecurity. These are all issues in which the nation state can play an important role, but is not the only answer. And one of the reasons we have a crisis of legitimacy in our democracy now is that to almost all of those problems, you need to apply a supranational international response. In other words, you need to beef up the capacity of governments to act together. And yet, for all sorts of complex reasons we've touched on, we are retreating from that very principle. And that is only going to make things worse, because then what will happen is you'll get this sort of, absurd, sort of cartoonish bombast that you get from people like Boris Johnson. All will be well, because we're great, and let the lion roar, blah, 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 blah. But what happens when people find that the lion can't do very much and is being defanged because the lion can't cooperate with other countries to keep us
and is
safe?
Is that where we're heading in this country? Is that what's going to happen in Trump's America too?
Well, I personally feel, now of course I come at this from a particular angle and everybody knows that, but if after the referendum Theresa May had stood on the steps of number 10 after David Cameron had vacated the scene and said, look, I didn't want this outcome in the referendum, but I wanted to remain myself, but I accept that this is now what I will deliver as Prime Minister. Brexit, dare I say it, she might have said, means Brexit. But she could have said, I'm also aware that I am now Prime Minister of a deeply divided country, between London, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the rest, between rich and poor, between those with higher education and those without, and crucially, between the young and the old. And she could have said, and I'm very mindful that all Prime Ministers should act not just for today, but for tomorrow, for the next generation, not just this one, for country, not party. And for that reason, I am going to seek a compromise. And it's going to be a bit messy. Yes, I will take us out of the European Union, but I will try and safeguard to the best of my abilities the core economic achievements which we built. It was Margaret Thatcher who built the single market, etc., etc., etc. Now, of course, that'll annoy tedious Ramonas like Nick Clegg who don't think we should leave at all. But I'm also going to disappoint advocates of an abrupt Brexit as well, because I think that such a neat, sort of narrowly divided country, we're condemned, if you like, to compromise with reality. Now,
how would that
why did she not do that? No,
country?
but here's the interesting thing. That would have been, in my view, not only more deliverable in the long run, not only right for the country in the long run, I think it would have been a more faithful reflection of the democratic mandate of the referendum itself. But why instead did she then decide to take such a narrow interpretation of this evenly divided debate and say, in effect, it's got to be Brexit at all costs, and I will unilaterally decide what that kind of Brexit is? Why? Because she felt on the defensive in her own party. So the other thing we need to do is encourage the political class and politicians to sometimes place country before their own party, and to place kind of better judgment before their own immediate political fate. It's not an easy thing to do, I know that, and you get roundly criticised for it, but that is something we should encourage in politicians more.
All right, I'd like to take some questions from our audience, if I may. What I'd like to do is, there is a microphone, maybe even more than one, roaming around. So when that arrives, if you could just say who you are, and if you could stand up so that everyone can see you. Gentleman there, and then I'll come to this gentleman over there.
My name's Paul Friedman. I'm from Canada. And when we have an election coming up, you start seeing bumper stickers that say, don't vote, it only encourages them. But that really is just a reflection of voting numbers are going down every election. You haven't spoken about just the number of people who just can't hold their nose and go into a voting place anymore. Perhaps you could speak about that.
Okay. What we might do is just take this other second question at the same time, and then we'll see. Is the gentleman just in there?
Hello, I'm Adam. I suppose I should self-declare as a civil servant. It seems that this sort of question about the coarsening of political language sits inside a kind of broader concern about the direction of Western democracy and the rise of a term that I don't particularly feel comfortable with, but sort of populism. And recently, including here, I've heard a number of people speak who have offered their pet theories on why the UK and, depending on one's opinion, the US have been spared the worst excesses of the rise of populist parties that have been seen in Europe. So John Major here last week attributed it to First Past the Post. Jon Snow spoke a few weeks ago and attributed it to the welfare state in the United Kingdom. And I just wondered, in the context of your pet theory about the structure of our economy, why do you think it is that we've had a different experience to Europe, specifically on that particular coarsening of the political sphere?
So take the first one on voting, if you would, Nick, first of all. Do you worry that people are falling out of love with the whole business of democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. And mass abstention has grown pretty remorselessly in recent times. Though I have to say, one of the most worrying things of all, of course, has been the very high levels of abstention, the very high levels of non-voting amongst younger voters. And much though I don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn's stance on most things, I think it is an incredibly good thing, an incredibly encouraging thing that so many young people flocked to his standard in the election in June, and that there was this sharp increase in both the registration and voting activity of younger voters, I think is immensely encouraging. And if that can be sustained, in other words...
Tuition fees, I think, was the key issue there, as I remember.
No, well, actually, I just disagree with that. I don't think people came out in droves but people don't come out for one policy. People take much more rounded and approximate judgments about why they vote for one party or one politician. I think the reason, quite understandably, why lots of young people voted for Jeremy Corbyn, why he was held aloft at Glastonbury and so on, is because they felt in general terms that he was kind of against what the Conservatives were doing on Brexit, which lots of young people basically don't like, even though he himself is a long-established Eurosceptic himself, but that doesn't matter, that was a detail, at least at that stage. And secondly, because he was kind of against austerity. And I think, people are very, very weary after years and years and years of being told we have to save money, there isn't enough money to spend on this, that and the other, suddenly having someone coming along saying, no, we don't need to make those agonising choices. So I don't say this, by the way, defensively, I don't remotely think, and there isn't actually much evidence that it was one policy that everyone, rallies to at all. But anyway, I just point that out because I do think if that represents a permanent rather than a one-off generational rebalancing of turnout, that will have a very, very profound effect and positive one on British politics, because it's become received wisdom until this June that basically the political parties and individual politicians have every incentive to cater to the grey vote and to older voters and have less pressure, if you like, to do so for younger voters. Adam, I think I see it slightly differently to you by the sounds of it. I regard Donald Trump, in a sense, as a classic populist, and I regard the utopian promises made by the Brexiteers as a classic form of populism too. So if anything, I would say the question is, as I alluded to earlier, why is it that despite the predictions that Geert Wilders would win, that Pepe Grillo would win, that Le Pen would win, that Podemos would win, that Alternative für Deutschland would win. Why are these things not happening?
We do have Nazis in the Bundestag, 60,000 people marching through.
They haven't disappeared. The question is not have they disappeared. It's the question, have they been as successful as the forms of populism that I think do loom very large in Anglo-American democracy. That's partly for the reasons I won't repeat, because I think there's something quite profoundly different about what I'd call high employment, low security, as opposed to a higher employment but higher security model across the channel. That's my intuitive view. But can I just say something very quickly about populism, because you quite rightly sort of squeamish about using the term. Populism isn't always bad. Of course it isn't. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi was a populist of sorts. Populism as a legitimate cry of anger and anguish against a status quo or an unfeeling elite who are not serving the people is a very, very powerful antidote to complacency, corruption, nepotism in politics and so on. The problem, I think, with most expressions of populism is that they first rely on the populists, and in that sense Trump is a classic populist, saying that they have a sort of unique, almost umbilical relationship with the people, the folk, who are all lumped together, right? So it's me and the people. That's what populists always do. You can hear it in what Viktor Orban says in Hungary, to what Le Pen said about the French people, to what Farage says about the British people. It's always the people against that ghastly, corrupt, out-of-touch elite who are against the people. And then, of course, what the populists do is they then say, and some of them do it very skillfully, that they feel people's legitimate frustrations and anger about the status quo, and they give people then something to blame, something to aim at. So Trump says, I will build a wall and all will be well. Farage says, we just have to come out of Europe and all will be well. Le Pen says you just blame on immigration, all will be well. Geert Wilders say blame on Islam, all will be well. And that's what's so pernicious about populism, is it's vindictive because it seeks to sort of victimize and attack something or some people or a religion or a group who are held to be responsible for wider ills, and it falsely suggests that very, very complex problems can all be reduced to one solution. And the thing that worries me probably more than anything else right now in democratic politics, certainly in Britain and America, is where does the rage go when populism doesn't work? What happens in the Rust Belt in America when they see, as they will, that Trump isn't delivering the promised land? Now, one thing, of course, inevitably will happen, is already happening, you can see it in the debate on Brexit in this country, is that when the populists fail to deliver their utopia, they have to find someone to blame. So be braced, be ready. The industrial scale of blame that is going to be heaped upon the French and the Germans and Eurocrats in the months ahead, because they are going to be held responsible if the Brexit negotiations don't turn out.
How you say that's the thing that worries you most. How do you think it might play out then? Are we going to see people on the streets? I mean, is it that serious, do you think?
No, I don't want to. It's not that so much. It's just that, I'd love to think that, I don't know, to take a slightly more distant example, that, the Rust Belt voters who have so much hope invested in Trump now, of course I'd love to think that they'll wake up one day and say, oh, this chap's been fibbing. He hasn't even built this wall, or even if he has, it's made no difference. And, I'm actually now a Democrat. But they're not going to do that. I think the risk is, of course, they'll look for the next populist. He'll come along with ever more extreme ideas. So my worry is that what you get a ratchet effect of populism, rather than a sort of tried out, it doesn't work, let's return to business as usual. And underlying all of this, of course, lies the underlying social and economic dissatisfaction that needs to be dealt with. And that's why, of course, one of the many, many tragedies in my view is that we desperately need in this country is to get down to the nitty-gritty of why we don't build enough homes, why there aren't more apprenticeships, why their pay isn't going up as much as it should do. That's the stuff we should be applying ourselves to, but instead we're going to be tying ourselves up in knots for years in this sort of magnificent displacement exercise, which actually will suck political energy away from the very things that in the long run are best placed to sort of lessen the pressure which is leading to populism in the first place.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions from the floor. One question there, and the gentleman there.
Hi there. You mentioned technology.
Just say who you are.
Oh, my name is Patrick White. You mentioned technology companies in terms of algorithms feeding people basically what they want, and the effect of that is sort of closed loops of communication. In terms of going forward, there's been talk about treating things like Facebook and Twitter more like media companies rather than technology companies, and actually being held responsible in similar ways. Do you think that's a good idea, or even workable?
Okay, and there's a question, where was it? There, yeah.
Hi, my name is Max. I actually grew up in Minnesota in the United States, and now I live in London, so I've seen the coarsening on both sides of the pond. Quick comment on something you were saying, actually. I think a part of it, because I have family that voted for Trump, and I think a part of it is actual hostile reaction to liberal policies and to, they see someone like Obama, and they're like, he can't represent us, we live in the country, and he's a city liberal, and he just cares about upper middle class people, or people who live in their bubble. So I think part of it, even more than policy, even more than populism, is just the sort of reaction of sort of their communities feeling left out of that. My question was going to be, there seems to be a sort of wide, at least in my view, a wide desire for a more civil political discourse, but yet at the same time, if you go on YouTube, any political video, there's just people leaving nasty comments, saying horrible things, even on Facebook, even on any politician's website, anything. So do you think there's sort of a double standard with people wanting a more civil discourse, and especially in Parliament here as well, but then sort of enjoying the entertainment of it and sort of enjoying being nasty and enjoying the sort of theatrics of that, in a sense?
Okay, two great questions. First one, quite a sort of a policy question on technology and the treatment of Facebook and Twitter and companies like that.
Look, the question you ask about should Facebook and other social media entities be treated as publishers, as if they were almost a conventional newspaper, entirely responsible for all the content that they carry, or are they platforms? It should be stressed that this takes place in the context of a wider debate, which I'm becoming increasingly interested in, which is, I think we're witnessing a brewing collision between, for want of a neater way of summarising them, Silicon Valley and public and political opinion, which is not just about the issue you've raised, publisher or platform. It's about fake news, about Russian influence, about paying your taxes or not paying your taxes. It's about, are they too big? It's about competition policy. There's a wider thing. My own view is that we desperately need a smart international debate between governments on how to settle a lot of these issues, because they're all slightly interlinked. On the specific issue of publisher versus platforms, I think it's self-evidently preposterous to suggest that Mark Zuckerberg should act as a newspaper editor for what 2 billion people choose to stick up on Facebook. It's self-evident. It's absurd. He and Facebook have obviously a duty to respect the law and to enforce it and to stop Facebook being a platform for illegal and abhorrent views. Where it gets into a grey area is what is considered to be acceptable or not, as opposed to illegal or not. And there I have to say, I personally think governments and politicians should take more responsibility. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to become a sort of censor in the sky.
The politicians to sort it out.
Yes, of course. No, it isn't. Because who should be the arbiter of what we think is acceptable or not? Or indeed where the shifting line of what is legal or not? It's not some guy in a T-shirt in Silicon Valley. That's something we as communities should decide through our own political debate, through our own parliaments, governments, and so on. And so I get very uncomfortable with this idea, not that they don't have responsibilities which they shouldn't exercise more fully, of course they should, but this idea that we're kind of making them sort of, yes, almost omniscient in responsibility for everything that appears on their platform. Now, of course, partly what's going on is a good old-fashioned spat between an old vested interest and a new intrusive media. So the newspaper industry, totally understandably, are having their advertising model completely ripped to shreds by these new platforms, so they're attacking them. So every time they find a post which is unedifying or unpleasant, or even if it's not illegal, it's slapped on the front page, and isn't it outrageous that these ghastly libertarians in California are not doing anything about it. But you've got to understand the vested interest which is behind some of this. So I think, yes, of course they need to change on a number of fronts. Personally, I think, I'm not directing this at Facebook, but I think some of the behaviour of these huge Silicon Valley giants when it comes to tax is just simply not on and not sustainable. But again, governments actually have got much, much more power to change the rules on tax than is sometimes allowed for. If governments really cooperated internationally, they wouldn't be able to play kind of cat and mouse with tax authorities. But anyway, so I think they need to change, but I am not personally convinced at all that it is either desirable or possible to expect Mark Zuckerberg, with 2 billion people now using Facebook, to act like a conventional newspaper editor. No.
What do you think about Max's point that the nature of the discourse in social media can be, and I'm sure you've experienced it, I certainly have, many people in this room will have experienced it, very vicious, very unpleasant?
No, it is. I mean,
is that a true reflection of part of human nature, or are we actually seeing the reality of what the people want to say and do?
No, I don't know. Though I have to say, I spent a very, very happy year as a postgraduate student at the University of Minnesota, where everyone was impeccably and unfailingly civilised, and I didn't come across one angry person there in a whole year. Mind you, everyone was very cold most of the time. That's what I do remember. I don't know. I don't know why people. I'm like many.
This was the point about civil discourse, and we want our politics to be conducted in a consensual and problem-solving way. Actually, what we're seeing much more in the public domain, because journalists and politicians were to some extent separated from those people. You perhaps saw them at a surgery. We might meet them very occasionally in the media, but for the most part, you didn't actually confront them. Now they're there every day in your inbox.
Well, that's interesting. So I don't think that's true at all. I think the one thing about the British political system that I would always defend and preserve, I think most of it is completely rotten and needs to be wholesale replaced. The one thing that we should always fight to preserve is the very intense exposure of British MPs to their constituents and their communities on a level which I don't think I know of in a similar intensity almost anywhere else in the democratic world.
So it's the same insurgery as it is on Twitter?
No, it's not. That's the whole point. But the point I'm trying to make to you is that I think, dare I say it, not directed at you, but far more than journalists, MPs, any hard-working constituency MP will be exposed to hundreds or thousands of their constituents every week, whether it's by email or in person at surgery or at town hall meetings or at visits and so on and so forth. And of course, 99.9% of those encounters are civilized, are peaceful, and so on. And so I think one of the things that's really, really important to remember, I don't know, I'm sure someone's done a numerical analysis, that the folk who really kind of just lose it on social media, much like people who lose it behind the wheel of a car in the sort of act of road rage, I would hazard a guess, remain a very, very, very small minority. But human nature being what it is, we always remember something that's nasty said to us, not something that's nice. And I'm always very struck by people who are not used to this environment, how they allow one stupid tweet or some outrageous social media comment to become their kind of, they extrapolate that to, that's how people think. And I say, no, it isn't. It's one person, or it's 6 people, or it's 20, or it's a few thousand. We're a community of 66 million people. And I sometimes think that those who are perhaps not used to it, hints of snowflake, need to just kind of, I mean, obviously, if it's not nice to be told nasty things, but quite a lot of this is just barking, ghastly, vile stuff said by a very, very small minority of people, and the best response to it is just to ignore it altogether. And I think that's maybe what we should do more of.
Okay, we've perhaps got time for just a couple more questions. I'm looking for a woman. You're a woman. You have one question there, and the gentleman at the back. And there's another woman over there. There's 2 women. Yeah, why not? I'm looking for a woman, yes. It's not what you should say in the lady chapel.
I'm Cressida. I'm 16 and I'd say I'm fairly interested in politics. I feel as if my future has been decided on by other people in the country. What's your view on lowering the voting age when it comes to long-term impacts such as leaving the EU?
Okay, and there's just a lady at the end of that row there. That will have to do us, I'm afraid.
Hi, my name's Anna Maria Carusi. I'm an academic. I'm actually at the University of Sheffield. I feel like I'm following Nick around. My question actually is to Mark. I'd like to take us back. Well, it's to both of you, but first to Mark. I'd like to take us back to the earlier part of this discussion when you remarked upon, well, possibly those who can't take the rough and tumble of this kind of political debate have to grow a pair of. Grow a pair of what?
Okay, I'll try and answer that.
And following up on that, I just want to say that there is a coarsening of political discourse, and women really bear the brunt of it. I mean, there is a very sharp divide there, and women really do suffer much more from this, and women politicians suffer much worse, in a much worse way from this. And I'd like to know if you have any comments about that.
Okay, Cressida's point on the voting age, Nick.
Yes, of course. You said you're 16, did you say, Cressida? Yeah, and of course 16 and 17-year-olds should be given the vote generally, and most especially when very big decisions are taken which will affect their future more than many other votes, of course. And in the same way, of course, if we're going to move from a model of representative democracy to direct democracy by referendum, you should have, as most mature democracies do, you should have a sort of minimum threshold, which we, by the way, used in referenda in this country in the 1970s before, which needs to be cleared before you enter into very profound changes with extensive constitutional implications. And it's something I find almost impossible to explain to my friends in other countries, how it's possible that we've taken this momentous decision on such a narrow outcome, only 650,000 votes in it, in the end, only 650,000 voters who voted Brexit needed to have voted the other way for it to be an even draw, and to do that without any minimum kind of turnout requirement, no minimum requirement how large the vote should be, and excluding many of the youngsters who will have to face the effects. And now this was debated in the House of Commons. I was in the House of Commons at the time, and myself and others supported lowering the voting age for the referendum to 16 and 17. It didn't happen for various reasons. By the way, in part, for one very old-fashioned reason, just complacency. There was a view at the time, certainly held in the government at the time, when the legislation paving the way for the referendum was being passed, that it would be effortlessly won by the Remain side. I am absolutely convinced that if the powers that be at the time had felt that it was going to be as narrow as it was, they would have thought much longer and harder about enlisting your help and in putting in place a constitutional requirement, as I say, which exists in most other democracies.
Just very quickly on Anna Maria's point, my answer to it is that I was deliberately using the phrase because there is a kind of macho culture in our politics. It is quite a sort of male debating club kind of atmosphere. A lot of women in Westminster say that. On Anna Maria's broader point about the role of women and their importance in creating perhaps a more civil discourse in our democracy. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, first I agree with Anne-Marie that, if you just listen to the testimony of Diane Abbott, Jess Phillips and others, it is just simply grotesque, the violent, abhorrent and sexist abuse that they've had to encounter. I don't think you implied this. I don't want to sort of suggest that somehow they're shrinking violets themselves when it comes to robust debate in Westminster, and they can dish out sort of rhetoric as well as any other politician. But in terms of abuse and threats and illegal threats, it is unspeakable what female MPs have to contend with now, and it's something which we desperately need to stamp out. So I think you're absolutely right. They are very, very much at the sharp end of some of the most abhorrent forms of abuse. Much of it, not all of it, expressed through social media.
Well, we've unfortunately come to the end of our time. We've managed to avoid unparliamentary words like blackguard, hooligan, and tart. And despite this, we've still, I think, actually had a fascinating and thought-provoking evening. So thank you very much indeed to the Right Honourable Nick Clegg.